Imagine, for a moment, a world where despair is not a fleeting shadow but a constant companion, a relentless tide that drowns hope before it even rises. This was 14th century Europe, a time when life itself felt like a cruel jest played by the cosmos. But before we dive fully into that century of unending calamity, let us turn the dial of time on a curious, magical door, one that can whisk us to eras so distant they make today's troubles seem almost trivial. First, the Precambrian Aeon, an honorable mention, because life itself was still whispering into existence. Then the Paleozoic era, strange and alien, yet still mercifully free of human suffering. And the Mesozoic. Oh yes, a world teeming with dinosaurs, a land of awe and terror, where survival meant simply avoiding becoming someone else's lunch. These are the eras that set the stage, preludes to the crescendo of human misery that awaited. Now, step through the door with me, and behold 14th century Europe, a continent locked in an unrelenting parade of disaster. It began with the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, when nature itself seemed to rebel. Endless rains drowned the fields, turned fertile soil into mud, and rotted the very grain that was meant to sustain humanity. Livestock perished, crops failed, and the desperation of starving peasants became a grim theater of survival. Rats, bark, and in the darkest corners of hunger, even neighbors became food. The rich hoarded what little remained, indifferent to the suffering, while over 1 million souls perished, leaving a continent gasping under the weight of famine and disease. No respite followed. By 1337, England and France erupted into the 100 Years' War, a conflict born of royal pride over who might sit on a throne, an argument over chairs that would scar Europe for over a century. Villages were burned, fields destroyed, and peasants slaughtered, caught in a world where nobility paraded in gleaming armor, pretending honor mattered as survival became a luxury. Technology, once a tool of creation, now sharpened into weapons of devastation. The longbow, gunpowder, proof that human ingenuity can also be human cruelty. And when the smoke of battle began to clear, another terror arrived. The Black Death, 1347, a plague riding aboard rat-infested ships, a darkness that spread faster than rumor. By 1351, a third of Europe's population lay dead, some in mass graves, some discarded in fields, their lives snuffed out as though humanity itself were being rewritten in suffering. 25 million souls vanished, leaving an imprint of despair so deep it would echo for centuries. Doctors scrambled desperately, armed with leeches, bloodletting, and every absurd concoction their medieval imaginations could summon, but nothing could stand against the plague. Flesh rotted, boils swelled to the size of apples, blood spewed from lungs, and whole families vanished within days. Ghost towns emerged, eerie and silent, while survivors wandered like lost spirits, questioning which god had turned their wrath upon humanity. Priests abandoned their flocks, convinced prayer could not save them, while flagellants whipped themselves in public, believing pain alone could end the disease. It did not. Laborers perished by the thousands, leaving fields fallow and cities crumbling. Landowners, accustomed to treating peasants as disposable tools, suddenly found themselves begging for workers. Wages rose for the lucky few who survived, a hollow victory paid for in millions of lives. And in true medieval tragedy, Jews were scapegoated, accused of poisoning wells and causing the plague. Thousands were burned alive, exiled, or slaughtered in senseless hatred, a dark reminder that bigotry is often humanity's first response to chaos. By mid-century, the oppressed had reached their breaking point. In France, the Jacquerie of 1358 erupted, a furious uprising of peasants storming noble estates, burning castles, and exacting revenge on aristocrats who had tormented them for generations. The revolt was mercilessly crushed, leaving the survivors to bury the dead and swallow the bitter truth. Justice was a luxury the powerless could never afford. Centuries later, Europe still had no mercy to offer. The 17th century ushered in the Little Ice Age, a bitter era when summers refused to warm and winters overstayed their welcome, mocking humanity with frozen rivers and relentless snow. Harvests failed with cruel regularity. Famine became a ritual, bread a rare luxury, and peasants gnawed on roots, weeds, and occasionally a rat for sustenance. Malnutrition left bodies vulnerable, and disease crept through towns with lethal ease, a shadow of death stalking every starving village. And then came the 30 Years' War, beginning in 1618, a religious conflict between Catholics and Protestants that rapidly descended into chaos so absurd, few even remembered the original cause. Armies rampaged across Central Europe, torching villages, looting towns, and leaving civilians to starve in the ashes. Mercenaries, armed hobos with no allegiance, plundered indiscriminately, compounding famine with the wreckage of war. Millions perished, not only from bullets and swords, but from the endless cascade of plague, hunger, and misery. Cities like Vienna and Milan fell to recurring outbreaks of bubonic plague, and with the living too few to care for the dead, mass graves became grim monuments to humanity's suffering. Trade ground to a halt as fear gripped Europe. Merchants refused to touch goods from plague-infested cities. Why risk a carpet of death with your silk or spices? Cities emptied, people fleeing to the countryside in a desperate gamble that fresh air might shield them from the invisible predator. Fleas and rats, of course, ignored human strategy entirely, spreading the plague like a shadow that could not be outrun. In the vacuum of fear, superstition flourished. Witch hunts surged, a grim carnival of paranoia and frustration. Women, often poor, often old, always vulnerable, were accused of consorting with the devil simply for existing or for a failed crop. Tortured until their screams matched the authorities' narrative, they confessed to fantastical crimes before meeting executions so inventive in their cruelty they would shame any modern horror film. Across Germany, France, and England, judges treated the trials as sport, the public as spectators, and humanity once again reveled in its own darkest impulses. In old Europe, it seemed, only the nobles truly lived untroubled. Meanwhile, the world beyond Europe was no kinder. The Mongol conquests of the 13th century, an era I conveniently sent you to witness through our magical door, were nothing short of apocalyptic. Genghis Khan, born Temujin, had transformed a coalition of steppe tribes into a relentless army of death. By the time the dust settled, between 30 and 40 million souls lay slain, nearly 1 in every 10 people on Earth. Cities were razed, survivors drowned, and fields salted, leaving landscapes that would whisper terror for centuries. It began in 1206, when Temujin, tired of tribal rivalries, united the Mongols under a single, brutal vision. Anyone who resisted was executed. Reborn as Genghis Khan, universal ruler, he unleashed his horse-mounted horde across Eurasia, leaving fire, skulls, and despair in their wake. Their first major conquest, the Khwarezmian Empire in 1209, showcased the Mongols' mastery of total war. Rivers were diverted to drown cities, supplies cut off, and prisoners used as human shields. Diplomacy was attempted once. The Khwarezmian ruler killed the envoys, thinking it clever. A fatal miscalculation. The Mongols responded with a ferocity that history remembers, proving that crossing Genghis Khan was the quickest way to vanish from the map. Even the Mongols, architects of apocalypse, were not immune to chaos. Their vast empire, born in blood and fire, eventually fractured into smaller khanates, the leaders turning on one another in relentless quests for power. Yet, long before infighting weakened them, the Mongols had left a trail of pandemonium so vast it turned thriving nations into wastelands, a legacy of death and fear etched across continents. Step now into another fallen titan of history, the late Roman Empire. The crisis of the 3rd century, from 235 to 284 AD, was a speedrun of self-destruction. Rome churned through 26 emperors in just under 50 years, most meeting violent deaths by assassination. Thrones became musical chairs soaked in blood, and the empire floundered like a headless chicken as barbarians gathered at the gates. Inflation skyrocketed, coins became worthless, and trade collapsed into the primitive bartering of goats for moldy wheat. If economic collapse wasn't enough, invasions from Goths, Persians, and other opportunists swept across the empire like wildfire. And just to ensure nothing was left standing, the plague of Cyprian struck in 249 AD, killing millions with shocking speed. Soldiers, farmers, citizens, none were spared, and corpses lay unburied in the streets. Armies weakened, borders undefended, famine spreading like a second shadow. Survival itself became punishment. Barbarian invasions escalated into full-blown apocalypses. The Goths sacked cities with terrifying efficiency, toppling Rome itself in 410 AD. The Vandals followed in 455 AD, leaving the empire's grandeur in ruins. Then came Attila the Hun, a living storm of destruction, battering through Europe with no subtlety and maximum devastation. As cities burned, roads crumbled, aqueducts collapsed, and public services failed. Clean water and functioning sewers became luxuries. Disease, poverty, and hunger were the inescapable norm. By 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire could no longer endure. The last emperor, Romulus Augustus, was deposed by Odoacer, and centuries of imperial might vanished almost overnight. Far to the east, mid-7th century China teetered under the weight of its own mismanagement. The Ming dynasty, which would rule for nearly 3 centuries, was already cracking under corruption, internal strife, and administrative collapse. The machinery of governance groaned under incompetence, proving that even the mightiest civilizations are fragile when misrule and decay take root. In China, a parade of clueless rulers and unchecked power grabs turned the imperial court into a festering pit of dysfunction. While the elites stabbed each other in the back for wealth and influence, the countryside suffered under a relentless combination of government neglect and nature's fury. Massive floods drowned crops, leaving stomachs empty and hopes crushed. Then, as if mocking human misery, droughts arrived to parch the land, and entire villages starved, caught between water and fire, with no aid from those in power. Amid this chaos, peasants lost patience. Revolts erupted like popcorn in a pan, but one figure rose above the rest. Li Zicheng, a former postal worker who traded mail routes for rebellion. Rallying starving peasants, he swept through cities, carving out his own fragile empire as the Ming court bickered and pointed fingers. Meanwhile, the Manchus, a nomadic people from beyond the Great Wall, watched and waited. Their moment came in 1644, not against the Ming directly, but against Li Zicheng's newly declared dynasty. The last Ming emperor, Chongzhen, hanged himself in the imperial garden, and Li Zicheng briefly claimed the throne. It was short-lived. The Manchus allied with Ming general Wu Sangui, who opened the gates of the Great Wall, allowing the Manchu army to march unchallenged into Beijing. Li Zicheng's forces crumbled, and the Qing dynasty was born. Cities that resisted were sacked, massacres were common, and the countryside remained a land of peril. Decades of corruption, neglected governance, and unpaid, unreliable armies had paved the way for conquest. For the average citizen, survival meant dodging rebel armies, Manchu cavalry, or the next catastrophic flood. Fast forward to the early 20th century. Europe became a stage for a global circus of destruction. It began with the First World War in 1914, pulling more than 30 nations into a 4-year slaughterhouse. One assassination, Gavrilo Princip shooting Archduke Franz Ferdinand, ignited a chain reaction that engulfed Germany, France, Britain, Russia, Austria-Hungary, and their colonies. Entire continents were dragged into the chaos, millions of lives caught in the machinery of modern industrial warfare, where bullets and shells replaced swords, and the scale of suffering dwarfed anything the world had seen before. The First World War dragged on like a nightmare that refused to end. Soldiers and allies alike were trapped in trench warfare, digging into filthy ditches for months, clawing over a few feet of mud while rats, disease, constant shelling, and the ever-present stench of death became their grim companions. Chemical weapons, like mustard gas, debuted, adding a new layer of horror to an already hellish existence. By 1918, around 20 million people were dead, soldiers and civilians alike, and another 21 million were wounded, many permanently scarred. The Treaty of Versailles drew lines on paper, but left a continent simmering with unresolved anger and resentments, tensions that would erupt catastrophically decades later. Before the world could recover, the Spanish flu pandemic arrived in 1918, riding the return of soldiers from the front lines. Unlike typical influenza strains that prey on the very young and very old, this virus targeted healthy adults in their 20s and 30s. Victims suffered severe respiratory distress, often turning blue from lack of oxygen before dying within hours. Hospitals overflowed, medical supplies vanished, and governments already crippled by war were powerless. By 1920, roughly a third of the world's population, around 500 million people, had been infected. Death toll estimates range from 20 to 50 million, with some suggesting as high as 100 million. More people had died from the flu than from the war itself. Cemeteries couldn't keep up. Mass graves became commonplace. Quarantines and mask mandates were met with varying compliance, often outright rebellion, fueling the virus's relentless spread. Meanwhile, Russia collapsed under its own weight. Tsar Nicholas II abdicated after the February Revolution, leaving a provisional government that lasted mere months. By October, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power in a bloody coup, plunging the nation into a civil war that would rage until 1923. Red versus white armies, countless factions, famine, and political purges left 7 to 12 million dead. When the Bolsheviks emerged victorious, they did so atop a mountain of blood and ruin. And just when you think history might catch a breath, Europe flares again, this time in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The French Revolution erupted in 1789, a violent response to decades of financial mismanagement, inequality, and the incompetence of King Louis XVI. Starving while the nobility feasted, the people stormed the Bastille and demanded change. What followed was the Reign of Terror, where Robespierre and fellow revolutionaries decided liberty and equality were best enforced by the guillotine. Thousands, including Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette, were executed in public squares. Political infighting and purges became the new pastime as revolutionary leaders turned on each other, proving that even the quest for freedom could drown in blood. While revolutionary France tore itself apart, the rest of Europe watched in terror. Monarchies across the continent feared the contagion of rebellion, and coalitions of powers, Britain, Austria, Prussia, waged war against the revolution, adding more blood to an already overflowing pile. By 1799, Europe was exhausted, and into the chaos strode Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon wasted no time. Crowned emperor in 1804, he set his sights on Europe. The Napoleonic Wars, spanning 1803 to 1815, were an endless carousel of conquest. Alliances shifted, armies marched, cities burned, and millions of soldiers were dragged into battlefields across the continent. By 1812, Napoleon made his fatal gamble, invading Russia. Over 600,000 men marched into Moscow, only to find it abandoned and aflame. Winter descended mercilessly, starvation, disease, and frostbite decimating the ranks. When Napoleon retreated, barely 10% of his army survived. His defeat at Waterloo in 1815 sealed the end of his imperial dream. In total, the Napoleonic Wars had claimed over 3.5 million lives, leaving Europe in ruins. Nature, as if mocking human suffering, delivered its own catastrophe. In 1815, Mount Tombora in Indonesia erupted in one of the largest volcanic explosions in recorded history. Ash and gases veiled the sun, plunging the globe into darkness. The following year, 1816, became the infamous Year Without a Summer. Crops failed across Europe, famine spread like wildfire, riots erupted over the scarce grain, and thousands of families sold everything just to survive, many still perishing. Disease followed in the wake of hunger. Typhus, dysentery, and malnutrition claimed countless lives. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the late 16th and early 17th century Americas were a nightmare for indigenous peoples. Europeans arrived with fire and steel. Spanish conquistadors like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro systematically dismantled the Aztec and Inca empires, enslaving or slaughtering entire populations for gold and glory. Disease, the invisible weapon Europeans unwittingly carried, spread faster than any army. Smallpox, measles, and influenza ravaged communities, killing up to 90% of some native populations within decades, before many Europeans even set foot in the New World. Entire civilizations were erased in the blink of a historical eye, leaving landscapes and cultures irreversibly scarred. For the survivors of conquest, life was no reprieve. Communities lay in ruins, leaders slain, and the ability to resist gone. Those who endured disease and slaughter faced the cruel machinery of colonial rule. The Spanish imposed the encomienda system, a legalized slavery in disguise. Indigenous peoples were forced into mines, plantations, or servitude for Spanish landowners, all under the pretense of civilizing them and converting them to Christianity. In silver-rich regions like Potosi, miners perished by the thousands, fueling Spain's empire. On Caribbean sugar plantations, life expectancy plunged to mere years. Cultural annihilation completed the devastation. Indigenous religions were outlawed, sacred sites destroyed, and traditions condemned as pagan or devil worship. Spanish priests burned native codices and religious artifacts, erasing centuries of history. Indigenous languages were replaced by Spanish or Portuguese, and those who resisted faced brutal punishment. Entire cultural identities were almost lost, surviving only in whispers, oral traditions, and hidden practices. And so, after centuries of famine, plague, war, and conquest, here we are in the 21st century. How does it feel to be alive now? Safe, maybe, liberated perhaps, or maybe just lucky to survive in a world shaped by millennia of chaos. Whatever you feel, history will remember us, whether for feats of wonder like the James Webb Space Telescope, or for moments of absurdity, like people Naruto running through Area 51. Humanity endures, a fragile, stubborn flame flickering against the relentless winds of time.